Has the government conducted secret UAP crash retrieval programs? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Were they designed to identify and reverse engineer alien craft? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do any U.S. contractors have the same?
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Behavioral Arts. My name is Spidey, and I use my degree in sociology and psychology, my certifications in criminal interrogation and body language analysis, and over 10 years' experience as an award-winning mentalist to teach people behavior analysis and practical psychology on stages and television shows all over the world. Earlier this month, U.S. Congress held yet another hearing concerning the truth about UAPs, formerly referred to as UFOs. At this specific hearing, we heard from 4 witnesses. They were former Navy Rear Admiral Dr. Timothy Gallaudet, former military intelligence official, government employee, and author Luis Elizondo, author and journalist Michael Shellenberger, and former NASA official Michael Gold. Using their wide range of credentials and experiences, they talked about what they believe the American government is hiding from the masses. But what do their body language, facial expressions, and word choice reveal? And just how much do these individuals and the government really know about non-human intelligence? Let's dive right in.
And raise your right hands. This is where it gets real. Do you solemnly swear to affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative.
Okay, so right there, before anybody even talks, while they're still taking the oath and swearing to tell the truth, we're seeing some really interesting nonverbal communication and a really strange symbol from one of the 4 witnesses. Here's a fun little exercise for those of you who don't know exactly who these 4 individuals are, and if you do, pretend you don't for a moment. If I told you that 2 of these 4 individuals have extensive military background and have been sworn into similar things before, and 2 of them not so much, based on only nonverbal communication, would you be able to determine which 2 have more comfort in this situation and which 2 aren't really sure what's going on just based on nonverbal communication? Because what we're seeing here is the 2 individuals on the left confidently stand up, hand up, look forward, take their oath, and then that's it. If you look at the 3rd one from the left, so that's Michael Shellenberger, that's the journalist, you see that when he stands up, he's got his hand in the wrong place. Even if the Congresswoman said, raise your right hand, he's got it up to his heart. And there are certain situations where you put it up to your heart, sometimes you put it up here, sometimes you put it on a Bible. In this case, maybe he misheard or he wasn't sure. He stood up and he did this. Then he notices that the other 2 don't have that going on, and he takes his cue from the 2 who are more experienced in this kind of thing and raises his hand. He follows suit. Then we have Michael Gold, the former NASA official, who is all the way on our right. And what happens with him is really interesting because when he first stands up, he gets it right hand up. But out of his peripherals, he must see that Shellenberger has it on his heart, and for a moment that makes him question it and go to his heart, but then he looks over even more, sees the other 2, and quickly goes right back up to where it's supposed to be. But that's not the weirdest thing about what's going on with him. What's weird is that at first we see it subtly, but by the end, by the time he's confirming that he will tell the truth, we see a hand position that's really strange and has to be deliberate. Because if you look at his hand, everyone else is like this. He's got a clear separation in the middle. In other words, his index and middle finger are to one side, and his pinky and ring finger are to the other side. Sci-fi fans will recognize this from the Star Trek franchise. Now, I knew that it was something Mr. Spock does, but as I looked it up, I found out that it's called the Vulcan salute, and it's exactly this gesture. Now, the reason I say this is deliberate is because, for one thing, we see it slowly happening more and more as he's about to take the oath, and there's this little smile on his face, almost like he knows that something's up, like something's going on. But secondly, if it was the thumb, index, or pinky just kind of relaxing away from the hand, it wouldn't be that big a deal, because the thumb, index, and pinky have separate muscles that allow them to move independently. But the middle finger and ring finger are very connected, and they're very difficult to move independently. And with magic and mentalism, we have these cute little demonstrations that we do that rely on this principle. And you can all try this at home now. If we put our hands together like this, palm to palm, all the fingers touching, and drop the middle fingers like this to where they're touching the back of the opposite hand, you'll notice we can all move our thumbs away like this. We can all move our index fingers away like this. We can move our pinkies away like this. But most of us cannot move those ring fingers. As long as everything else is in contact, those ring fingers do not move. So yes, as we see hands relax, we might notice those fingers coming apart a little bit, but it's either they're all coming apart, you might see the thumbs relax a little, but to have these two stay together and relax only in the middle, that's deliberate. I think it's easy to imagine that Mr. Gold here has a couple of friends who are Star Trek fans, and he's going to Congress to talk about UAPs and, things that are related to sci-fi. And I think it's possible that he's kind of doing this as a little bit of a nod to his friends and other Star Trek fans. Just with a few seconds of observing this guy, we can already do something that interrogators do and mentalists do for entertainment, which is called profiling. By observing the way someone behaves, interacts, and decisions that they make, we know a couple of things about the way they function and the way they think. In an interrogation, we use this to more effectively communicate with the person, but with mentalism, we use it to do what's called a cold reading and tell the person things about themselves. So in the case of Mr. Gold, we saw that even if he had something right, he looked over to the guy next to him and tried to follow along. So he took his cue from someone else and then retook his cue from someone else and put it back up. We also see that he's doing this little thing to try to appeal to a certain demographic that he feels he has a sense of belonging with. So this is someone who looks to belong, wants to be part of something. And we're going to continue to see this again and again and again in the way that he communicates. It's a lot about his attempt to be part of something, to be included, and that's very important to him. The next clip we're going to look at is really interesting because the reason I'm focusing on this is not for the obvious reason. And I wonder as you watch this clip if you could figure out why I think this clip is a great lesson in nonverbal communication. Take a look.
Current dominant alternative theories, including those put forward by Arrow, are that UAPs are some kind of natural phenomena we don't yet understand, like ball lightning or plasma. They could also be part of some new U.S. or foreign government weapons programs, such as drones, aircraft, balloons, CGI, hoaxes, or birds. Whatever UAPs are, Congress must be informed, as must the people of the United States. A leading UAP researcher who utilizes the Freedom of Information Act to find out what the government knows, John Greenwald, told me last year that the U.S. government had been increasingly denying his request for UAP information. He has been doing FOIA requests for 27 years and has an archive of 3 million pages. The government has for decades denied any interest in UFOs, he told me, but the documents that he has assembled show that behind the scenes, it was a completely different story. Contrary to the hopes of many advocates of transparency, the government has been restricting more information since the leak of 3 UAP videos in 2017.
Okay, so I wonder how many of you realize that the really great lesson here for nonverbal communication is not with Michael Schellenberger, who's just reading a written script, but it's with Luis Elizondo, who's next to him, reacting to the things that he's saying. And that's the thing we don't talk about on the channel very often, is reactions, and it's something we should talk about, because when we're presenting and we know people are watching, sometimes because of that consciousness, we are a little bit better at masking certain things. But when we don't realize that there's focus on us because someone else is talking, we often leak a lot more information. And here, it's like Luis Elizondo is telling us exactly what's on his mind. So the first little cluster of tells is when Schellenberger says that Arrow has claimed that these UAPs might be natural phenomena that we don't yet understand, like ball lightning or plasma.
Some kind of natural phenomena we don't yet understand, like ball lightning or plasma. They could also be part of some new U.S. or foreign.
And as he's saying that, if you look at Mr. Elizondo, we see two things happening. One is we see the lips compress, and the second is we see this no gesture. So we often talk about lip compression on the channel because compressed lips happen most often in disagreement or withheld opinion. And this isn't something I'm just making up now because this is a perfect example of it. If you go back to any analysis I've done where we talked about compressed lips, I've always said that socially it suggests disagreement or withheld opinion. I've even said that you often see it as a reaction in someone who's not talking. Like if someone's saying something and you disagree or you have an opinion that you don't want to share or can't share, we often see the lips compress. It's a way for us to try to hold those words in, and sometimes we even hear the person go, I'm not so sure. So they vocally disagree, but we see the lip compression first. So in this case, we're getting that lip compression of disagreement, maybe a withheld opinion, there's something I have to add to this, and we're seeing that quick no gesture, also of disagreement. Now the no gesture we do have to be careful with. Not every time somebody does this, does it mean a disagreement or some sort of deception. Sometimes we emphasize like this. Sometimes we express disbelief like this. I can't believe how amazing this is. But that's a little bit more slower and with the rhythm of what we're saying. When we have this little jittery no like this, especially with that lip compression like this, that is a very confident cluster of disagreement. In other words, what's being said here, he doesn't agree with. To increase my confidence with this disagreement, as Schellenberger continues and says, there are other explanations, drones, hoaxes, birds, and a bunch of other stuff, this time we see Mr. Elizondo chuckle, so we see this kind of bit of a chuckle, and again, that no gesture. So this whole time he's just disagreeing with all these alternative explanations. Then the subject changes to John Greenwald, who has gone to the government to try to get some information. And as he's talking about how his requests were denied, we see Mr. Elizondo, this time, he's nodding along, like he's aware of this and he knows that this happens. Finally, as Schellenberger continues and says that Greenwald's documents that he assembled show that it's a completely different story behind the scenes, we see three things with Luis Elizondo.
Behind the scenes, it was a completely different story. Contrary to the hopes of many advocates.
The first is, again, that nodding gesture. So this time he's agreeing with this. So, yep, it's a completely different story. The second is a mouth shrug, which is very similar to a lip compression, but it's raised. And usually you see it with a bit of puffing on the upper lip, and over here you see the cheeks bubble out a little bit. The first time he did it, we just saw those lips thin out. But this time we physically see the lips rise and the cheeks puff out. Some of the best research on shrugging was conducted by Camille Debras at Université Paris-Nanterre, and she found that all shrugs, including mouth shrugs, denote a lack of something. I don't something. I don't care, I don't know, I don't want to do that. And sometimes it denotes I don't have anything to add to what you've already established. So somebody might make a really good point and you go, yep, exactly. I can't add anything to that. Sometimes even the shoulders go, yep, perfect, that was perfect. And that's what this is. It's him going, yep, exactly. And at the same time, we have that nod and we have an eyebrow flash, another body part that's extremely highly researched. And one of the reasons we see eyebrow flashes is for emphasis. So when we emphasize something important, in fact, in conversations, the research has shown that just before we make an important point, we see those eyebrows come up as a way to signal, now this is important. So all these things, that mouth shrug, that nodding, and that eyebrow flash are giving importance to this and going, yup, now this is a big one, pay attention to that. Now we're going to look at the questions that were asked by Congress, and because this was a very long hearing, I'm going to focus on the answers that had the best opportunities for behavioral analysis. Interesting word choice, great nonverbal communication, because that's what I do. But I do want to send a massive thank you to my friend Chris Ramsey from Area 52 Investigations. He was actually at the hearing and we had a long conversation. He gave me a lot of context to really understand what's going on to do this much more effectively. He creates insanely awesome content, all related to this kind of stuff. He does really deep investigations. He's done a bunch of stuff on site. So I'll leave more information about his channel in the description. Make sure to go check him out. Oh, and another quick thing. For those of you who are on Facebook, and I know not everyone is, and that's fine, but for those of you who are, we just launched the Behavioral Arts Facebook page. And this will be a place where if you find videos online that you think are interesting, you could post them there and give your analysis and get some conversations going. I'll chime in. You could send me some recommendations. I'm also going to put some short form videos there as well. And early engagement is really important for the growth of a page. So I'll leave a link in the description, and I'd really appreciate if you guys could give me a follow, comment on the posts, share the videos, because these things help a lot to get some momentum. It's not going to take any time away from YouTube. I will still be uploading here the same way I always was. It's just a side little thing that we're working on, and I'm really excited to see you there and here as well.
Mr. Elizondo, you state in your testimony that, quote, advanced technologies not by our government or any other government are monitoring sensitive military installations around the globe, end quote. If these technologies are not made by any government, who's making them? Private companies, or are you implying they are crafted by a non-human intelligence?
Well, ma'am, that's precisely why we're here. The problem is that, temporally speaking, over decades, not just the last 10 years, before, to put this in perspective, when
Are these private companies you're implying, or is this non-human intelligence?
it may be both.
Okay.
When it comes to Blue Force Technologies, I would not be able to discuss that,
Okay.
ma'am,
Are you read into secret UAP crash retrieval programs?
we would have to have a conversation in a closed session, ma'am. I signed documentation 3 years ago that restricts my ability to discuss specifically crash retrievals. I submitted for my book through the DOPSR process, which took a year for it to be reviewed. And what is in the book is what I was told I'm allowed to talk about.
Has the government conducted secret UAP crash retrieval programs? Yes or no?
Yes,
Okay. Were they designed to identify and reverse engineer alien craft? Yes or no?
yes.
Do any U.S. contractors have the same?
I would prefer to address that in a closed session, ma'am.
Okay. In your book, you mentioned government employees who've been injured by UAPs, placed on leave, and receiving government compensation for their injuries. Is that correct?
That is correct.
How can the government deny we have recovered craft if they're paying people because they've been injured by recovered craft?
Ma'am, that's a great question. That's why I think we're here again, because I've seen the documentation by the U.S. government for several of these individuals who have sustained injuries as a result of a UAP incident.
It's a crazy idea, right? The hypocrisy.
Okay, a lot going on with Mr. Elizondo here. And from a nonverbal perspective, I want you to notice that throughout this answer and often throughout the hearing, we see his hands together like this. And if we look at the thumbs, we see some massaging gestures going on like this. And sometimes it's a little more like this, sometimes like this. Sometimes they're separate, but he's still doing this. And these are called, there's a lot of words for them in the research, adapters, self-soothing gestures, pacifiers, manipulators, and there's a lot of research on this. And they help soothe us in moments of stress. But in this case, it's also part of what we call his baseline because it's happening a lot. It's not like he was chill, relaxed, and a specific topic came up and all of a sudden we see this self-soothing that would indicate, okay, something's changing here. He's stressed about this. So this could just be the way he communicates. You know, he just developed this habit. Or it could be that he's stressed throughout this whole thing with this topic. A big part of my focus for this back and forth, however, is going to be the word choice because I pay a lot of attention to words and there's some very interesting stuff going on here. So she starts by quoting something that he said verbatim in his opening speech, where he said that there are advanced technologies out there, not by our government or any other government, that are monitoring military installations. Those were his words.
Advanced technologies not made by our government or any other government are monitoring sensitive military installations around the globe.
But what I find interesting about that is that we have a man here who's saying that our government is very secretive and there are things that they have that they're not talking about, that they're not disclosing. This is his position. Also, I think it would be unreasonable to assume that somebody who worked for the US government would know every single detail of what every single other government is working on, yet he's making a claim that these technologies are not by any part of our government or any other government. And I found this interesting because usually he tends to preface things that he's not sure about by saying, I'm not entirely sure, or this is what I do know. But in this case, that's a big statement for someone who has said our government is secretive and can't possibly know what everyone else is working on. So already that's a very bold statement that no one is working on this. He can't really know that. Then she asks if what he means by it's not the government's is that this is being worked on by private companies or if these are non-human intelligence. And at first he kind of tries to deflect the question. He says, well, that's what we're here to figure out. And he goes to this whole story, but she cuts him off and asks again, is this private companies or non-human intelligence? And he says, this could be both. And then he volunteers this information that I'm not really sure where it's coming from nor what it means, because he says, when it comes to Blue Force technologies, I wouldn't be able to discuss.
Are these private companies you're implying, or is this non-human intelligence?
It may be both.
Okay.
When it comes to Blue Force technologies, I would not be able to discuss.
Okay. Are you ready?
And what's interesting about that is nobody asked about Blue Force technologies. In fact, I'm not entirely certain what he means by that. Because as I look it up, Blue Force Technologies is the name of a company in North Carolina, and they specialize in advanced aerospace systems. So there is a company that works kind of in this space, but I couldn't find any connection between Luis Elizondo and them. And furthermore, nobody asked. So he's just volunteering this thing out of nowhere. So it got me wondering, is he talking about this actual company, or is the company named after something else and Blue Force Technology means something else? Because for example, I know that in the military, blue means the military itself. So if they say blue on blue injury, it means that somebody got injured by someone in the military from their own side. So is that what he's talking about? Like I can't discuss Blue Force technology, like independent, friendly technologies that we have on US soil? Is that what he means? And this company is named after that? Or is he talking about this company itself? Either way, it's this strange thing where he just threw in this term and said, I can't talk about this thing that nobody else talked about. Then he does something that we've heard before, and I always have a lot of questions about, because he does it now and he's going to do it again later in the hearing, where he says that he went through a process. He signed a document, he had to submit and wait for a year, and that he was told what he's allowed to talk about and what he's not allowed to talk about. And that everything he's talked about in the book was approved by some government body. So this is very similar to what David Grush, the whistleblower, said last year, right? He came out as a whistleblower, but then he said that he actually went through the whistleblower procedure and has been told that these are all things he can discuss. And every time I see this, I ask myself, So really, what secret information are we getting here? Because this to me feels like a controlled leak. Somebody has told you from the government, yeah, it's okay, you could go ahead and talk about these things. So they're not trying to hide these things because they're giving you permission to talk about it. Everything he talks about in his book, everything he talks about at this hearing, crash retrieval programs, pilots who were injured by UAP, and government programs who take care of those pilots, somebody at the government looked at all that and said, yeah, it's okay, you can go talk about this. But then when they're asked about it, they're hush-hush and they don't really want to open up. So it doesn't really make sense. Then we get two direct, unambiguous answers. She asks, has the government conducted secret UAP crash retrieval programs? And he says, yes. Right away, yes. So this is under oath. He's saying yes to this. And also, the government allowed him to say yes to this. Then she asks, were they designed to identify and reverse engineer alien craft? And he also says yes to that. And so again, he's convinced under oath that these programs exist to collect and reverse engineer alien craft. And what I find interesting about that second question is she says alien, not non-human intelligence, alien. He's later on going to go to say that we can't really be sure what it is. You know, non-human intelligence doesn't necessarily mean alien, but in this case, he gives a firm yes to this question.
Okay, were they designed to identify and reverse engineer alien craft, yes or no?
Yes.
So I think at the very least, this suggests that although at other times when he's asked to clarify, he gives that clarification that we can't know for a fact that it's aliens, by answering yes here without correcting that, he's showing that his best guess is most likely that these things are alien technology. Next up, she asks, do any US contractors do the same? In other words, do private US contractors collect evidence and try to reverse engineer? And he says, I would prefer to address that in a closed setting. And this is one of those things where a non-answer is an answer. If the answer was no, or he didn't have that information, he would say, I don't have any reason to believe that. But by saying he can only talk about this in private, he's confirming that he might have some information about some private organizations who are working on this kind of thing. And then the final exchange is interesting because he says that in his book, he talked about government employees who were injured by UAPs, placed on leave, or received compensation for their injuries. And he confirms that that is correct. The government has a system in place to compensate employees who were injured by UAPs. It's an acknowledgement that UAPs exist. Because I don't think the government, for example, has a program to compensate employees who were injured by leprechauns. So there's an acknowledgement there that this thing is real.
You specifically said the document said you can't talk about crash retrieval. Well, you know, you can't talk about Fight Club if there's no Fight Club.
Correct.
Okay, I'm just making an observation.
Yes, sir.
So that document that you signed, that you said exists, specifically said you can't talk about crash retrieval.
Correct, sir. It was a limitation on what because already I'd been speaking publicly about the topic. And so the document said you can continue saying X, Y, Z, but you cannot discuss the topic.
When you,
of crash
give
retrieval.
me your background real quick.
My background is I went to school to study microbiology and immunology, entered into the U.S. Army, and after a very short stint in military intelligence, I became a counterintelligence special agent. As a civilian, later on I became a special agent in charge, running investigations in counterterrorism and counterespionage primarily, with some experience in counterinsurgency and counternarcotics. And then in 2009 timeframe, when I came back to the Pentagon after a tour with the Director of National Intelligence, I quickly became part of a program that was originally called OSAP that evolved into the program now called ATIP, which is where those videos that we now see, the Go Fast, the Gimbal, the FLIR, that was part of our effort, sir.
Right. So you're not some conspiracy theorist. You actually have a legitimate background.
Well, sir, I'm certainly not a conspiracy theorist. I'm fact-based, just a fact.
So when you're in this room, I want to paint the picture of everybody. You're in this room, you're by yourself, you're in a skiff, you're handed a document. How long is the document?
It's about a page front and back. So basically you have some things they call trigraphs, which I cannot, again, talk to.
How long were you given to sign the document?
As long as I needed, sir.
And what if you didn't sign it?
Well, I suspect there'd be repercussions.
Okay, another fascinating exchange with Mr. Elizondo here. And in this one, the congressman starts by saying that you said you signed a document that said you can't talk about crash retrieval and you can't talk about Fight Club if there's no Fight Club. So going back to my previous example, no one's signing documents saying you can't talk about leprechaun encounters because most likely those haven't happened. So it's a good point to say, if they're having you sign a document saying you can't talk about crash retrievals, there's something to talk about. That said, my mind goes back to a controlled leak, because in that document, they could have just as easily said, you can't talk about crash retrievals, and you can't talk about not talking about crash retrievals. I've signed a lot of NDAs, certainly nowhere near this level of discretion and confidentiality, and they often say, not only can you not talk about this, you can't even mention that something like this happened, that you're working on a big project. They want it completely hushed. So it's like this document said, okay, you can't talk about what's happening at the crash retrievals, but we're okay with you talking about the existence of crash retrievals. That's bizarre. Then we get his background, which is very impressive. He worked in the military, he worked high up at the government, he worked at a program that is designed to get information on UAPs. But then he's asked by the congressman, so you're not a conspiracy theorist? And he goes, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I'm fact-based. And although it would appear that during this hearing, he is trying a lot to stick to the facts, and there are places where he says, I'm not qualified to answer that, and there are other places where he says, I don't have that information. His book tour does tell a different story, because there have been some articles out there that on his book tour, he presented things in his seminars or in his speeches to the audience that were proven to be false, like photographs of certain crafts that were proven to be old social media posts. So when he's saying that he's fact-based, I find it interesting that there were things in his presentation that were not fact. And he addressed it. He said, I'm sorry about that. I was given this by one of my sources. And for him to add it to his presentation, it means that he didn't quite fact check. So it's interesting how we have a bit of both, because we have evidence that on the book tour, he's not entirely fact-based, but maybe because it's a book tour, right? He has to present an interesting story. He has to sell tickets. He has to get people to show up. So maybe he's a little easier with what's being presented there, whereas this is in Congress, under oath, so he's being a lot more careful with the things that he talks about. Finally, the congressman asks, how long was this document? And he does something he did before. He says, it's a page front and back, and there's this thing on it called trigraphs, but I can't talk about that.
How long is the document?
It's about a page front and back. So basically you have some things they call trigraphs, which I cannot, again, talk.
But like nobody else was talking about it. In fact, most of us have no idea what a trigraph is. I had to look it up. Turns out it's like a 3-letter code that is like an abbreviation on classified documents. But the bottom line is nobody asked about that. Nobody asked about trigraphs. He just said, how long is the document? So again, like that Blue Force technology, he volunteers this information, then immediately says that, oh, he can't talk about the trigraphs. You know, it's important, can't talk about it. But he's the one who brought it up. And I feel like he does these things, and we see it at several points throughout the hearing where he drops these little industry terms, like trigraphs, to kind of signal that he really knows his stuff, right? Like he's really involved in all this stuff because he knows about the trigraphs. We don't know about the trigraphs, but he does. So he drops it in there when nobody asked, and then immediately goes, no, but I can't talk about the trigraphs. And it's just a way for him to establish credibility. He knows about the secret stuff and all the words.
During a hearing, NASA Administrator Nelson affirmed the importance of NASA in helping us to understand UAP. Mr. Gold, if the government doesn't have the data it needs on UAP because, say, someone who saw something is concerned about stigma, public backlash, etc., or maybe there's just not good systems in place, how are we supposed to ultimately figure out what's going on?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And let me compliment Administrator Nelson that there wouldn't have been a UAP independent study team if it wasn't for his leadership and courage. We're talking about data and where we can get data from. As I described, NASA has whole archives of data, much of which I believe will likely have information that will help inform UAP. We need only look. And again, in an era with AI and ML, we can relatively quickly and easily go through it. So I think it's something that we should encourage NASA to do.
Now we're hearing from Mr. Gold, and all we're going to get here is a confirmation of things that we could have observed in a couple of seconds before he even spoke. Because he's being asked here about NASA and how we could get more information, and he starts off by praising Administrator Nelson. So right away, he gives praise to someone else. Then he starts by saying, we're talking about data here, and he turns to look at his colleagues sitting next to him with this gesture that suggests together. We're all talking about this together. So this is someone, once again, who just wants to fit in, wants to belong, gives praise to someone else that works in his field, talks about what we're talking about here together, looks over to them. This is the exact same guy we saw earlier put up his hand, then notice that the person next to him had it here and go here, and then notice that the other two had it here and bring it up here, and then try to appeal to a certain demographic, to fit in, to belong. And he's still doing the same thing here with his words. Then he formulates a sentence that loses so much steam it's unbelievable, because he's asked about how we could get this information, and he starts by saying NASA has whole archives of data. And I'm like, yes, this ex-NASA official is saying that they have whole archives of data. But then he continues, much of which I believe will likely have information that will help, inform about UAPs and so on and so on. So those are two words that lack confidence and certainty. I believe will likely.
NASA has whole archives of data, much of which I believe will likely have information that will help inform UAP. We need only look.
Imagine as an example, I get back from a restaurant and you're going to go next week and you call me and you say, hey, I'm going to go to this restaurant. Do they have a vegetarian menu? And I go, I believe it's likely they have some vegetarian options. You're still going to call that restaurant to find out, because that's not very confident. All he's telling us here is that he doesn't really know. That he worked at NASA for a while, he may have, heard stuff, or he suspects things, but he doesn't know for a fact that in these archives there's any valid information. He believes that it's likely.
To your knowledge, have any USOs ever outpaced our submarines?
Yes, ma'am.
At what magnitude?
I don't have the exact speed, but again, a witness came to me, a credible former submarine officer who observed it on sonar data. And this was in the 80s in the North Atlantic during a storm, and it outpaced his submarine by orders of magnitude.
Are you aware of any hotspots that currently exist off our shores in North America?
Not with sufficiently credible data, ma'am.
And then we hear from Timothy Gallaudet, and he has an extensive background, not just in the Navy, but also working in the government in the field of the atmosphere and the oceans. A lot of experience there. And what I like about this is when he's being asked these questions, and we see this a lot with him throughout, he very openly says when he has credible sources for something or has good reason to believe something, but very often bows out if he doesn't know. So when he's asked here if there are USOs who have outperformed US submarines, he says, yes, ma'am, and then says that he has a credible source who's a former submarine officer who told him personally that what happened and what he observed. And he deems that to be credible. And then when he's asked a follow-up question about, are there any hot spots in the ocean, he said he doesn't have any credible source on that. He doesn't know. So he's not going to speculate based on what he's seen out there. He doesn't have that information. And it's important to note, a few things. First, you'll notice throughout, he's a little bit more to himself, a little more closed in. He keeps shuffling around with his papers. I don't think that this man is necessarily looking for the spotlight. He's also not promoting, a book tour or a stream that he's on. He's done some interviews, but there are definitely a lot more people in this space who are out there trying to promote their story. He's not really one of them. He has this little booklet. It's like 25 pages long. I found a free version online pretty much effortlessly. So he's not out there trying to promote something. And whenever he's asked a question, he sticks to what he knows. Now, what he knows isn't that much. He was part of a chain of emails where another part of his team observed something and was writing to the team saying, does anybody know what this is? And then that chain of emails disappeared without a trace the next day, and it never came up again. So that's pretty much his firsthand experience. But what he is saying, however little it is, I feel like is being presented in a very matter-of-fact, straightforward manner. Of course, he's not one of the main focuses, so I don't have a lot of time to observe a lot of what he's saying, but that's just the vibe I'm getting. He's sticking to the things he knows and not looking for that clout, just saying, here's what I know, here's what I don't know.
In our previous panel, we had Grush, and he had testified to say that some of these were interdimensional beings. Can you speak on that at all?
Ma'am, I'm not qualified, certainly as a scientist or otherwise, to speculate points of origin. I looked at everything from a scientific perspective. So if you look at, for example, instantaneous acceleration, which was one of the observables of the program that I belong to, ATIP, the human body can withstand about 9 G-forces for a short period of time before you suffer negative biological consequences, blackouts and ultimately redouts and even death. Comparison, our best technology, the F-16, which is one of this older platform, but one of our most highly maneuverable aircraft, manned aircraft, made by General Dynamics can perform about 17 or 18 G-forces before you start having structural failure, meaning that the airframe begins to disintegrate while you're flying. The vehicles we're talking about are performing in excess of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 Gs.
So are you, I guess, would it be safe to infer that they're living craft?
I'm not prepared at this point to state for the record is something alive or not, because even that definition is hard. There was a time in science we thought that life required oxygen, and we now know that's not true. There are anaerobic bacteria that thrive in oxygen environments that lack oxygen. And so also same with photosynthesis. When I was in college, I was told everything is derived from photosynthesis as a form of energy. In reality, that's not true. There are things that live off of chemosynthesis. So we're constantly having to reevaluate our understanding of what the definition of life is.
I wanted to play that clip because it's a really good example of one of the rare times that he deviates from his behavioral baseline. Because most of the time he's sitting there, hands are either together or very close to each other with these little massage-like gestures. And he doesn't have what we call illustrators. His hands aren't moving to demonstrate his points. But in this case, the moment he starts talking about acceleration and G-force and what's normal, he goes into this thing where his confidence is up, he's speaking more confidently, his gestures come to life as he's using his hands to illustrate what he's saying, and it seems like there are little stretches there where it's just flowing. Particularly when he says how at 9 G-force, the body will experience blackouts, ultimately redouts, and even death. Then she asks about if these things are alive, and he goes back to that hands on the table, a little bit more closed in like this. His tone softens as well as he talks about he's not in a position to state for the record what's alive. Then he goes into another thing where he talks about, how we used to think life requires oxygen, and he talks about photosynthesis and what we thought about that. And again, he comes to life. That confidence comes back up, and again, it seems like it flows very comfortably. So I wonder if these topics, the G-force and then what we thought we knew about life, are part of his seminar or his speech or things that he says on podcasts or on his book tour, because there's a comfort there. There's a presentational comfort there that we're not seeing elsewhere. And maybe if any of you have seen him speaking live, you can address this. Are these topics that he's talked about on stage? Because I suspect that the comfort there is there for a reason.
Do you believe, just for the record, that the federal government, any part of the federal government, is knowingly concealing evidence about UAPs from the public?
Yes, sir.
100%.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. I also want to just go down the line. I know many of you have already said this, but I just, for the record again, just briefly, what do you believe UAPs could be or are?
Strong evidence that they are non-human, higher intelligence.
I echo my colleague's comment, sir.
Genuinely do not know.
Don't know, but we must find out.
Okay, so I really like this moment because a lot of the time in these hearings, we can only talk about this in private, we don't really know this, and they switch towards that, and it's almost like I was told this, but I haven't seen this. But now they're flat out being asked, is the government concealing evidence of UAPs? And we have, witnesses here of varying credibility and knowledge, but each one of them goes, yes, 100%, yes, yes. No ambiguity. So with their combined experience, they are stating that this is being done. This amount of direct answer from all four, are they under oath? Are they all lying? And there's no caveats. They're not saying, well, I believe given that, no. Yes, all four under oath. It can't be nothing. Then he asks, what are UAPs? And we get answers that are pretty consistent with what we've been seeing from these gentlemen so far. So Dr. Gallaudet goes first. And he says that there is strong evidence that they are non-human higher intelligence. So he doesn't claim it. He says there's strong evidence that is compelling to him that these are, and he doesn't qualify it too specifically, non-human higher intelligence, not aliens, not from a different planet, just non-human higher intelligence. Because the evidence that he's seen in that email exchange and from what some of his colleagues have told him is that these are doing things that, according to his knowledge, human vessels cannot do. So strong evidence that that's what this is. Next is Mr. Elizondo, who says, I echo that. So again, it's strong evidence that it's non-human higher intelligence. Then we have the journalist, Mr. Schellenberger, who says he genuinely doesn't know. And that's a fair answer for someone who's just conveying third-party information. And finally, we have Mr. Gold, who says, I don't know, but we must find out. And it's like, yeah, we know that's why the hearing is happening. We must find out. We get it. So just more don't know. And given what we have, this is what we think. And these are reasonable answers.
If we were in a secure setting, if we were in a SCIF, would you be able to provide or get access to something, whether it's a visuals or material that we could put our hands on, or biologics that would convince me, that would show me that we have non-human origins?
Sir, that decision would not be mine. That would be to the gatekeeper still in the U.S. government. I was wearing my national security hat, even if there was a 2% chance that there was some sort of hostile intent here. That's 2% higher than we really can accept. And so we must figure out, there's a calculus, capabilities versus intent, in order to identify if something is a national security threat. We've seen some of the capabilities, yet we have no idea in the intent. And so this is why this discussion is somewhat, I think, problematic from a governmental perspective, because we have no idea.
Okay, really quick on this one, once again with word choice, because the words are giving away a lot here. The congressman here is asking, would you, in a SCIF, would you be able to provide me with visuals, materials, or biologics, anything that would convince me that this is happening? And there's one of those three that I'm putting a lot more focus on, and it's visuals. Because it would be a different question if he said, can you provide me with materials or biologics? In other words, you know, do you have an alien somewhere in your basement that you can give me so I could see it? But he's not saying it. He's also saying visuals. And what does Elizondo say to that? He says that that decision is not up to him. It's the gatekeepers of the US government. And that's interesting, given that he's on a book tour and in his speeches, he's showing visuals. He's showing footage and he's showing photographs and he's showing certain evidence that he finds compelling. So what I find interesting here is that he's not bringing it up at all and saying that, listen, I have photographs, I have some footage, but I don't have biologics or actual evidence. That's someone at the government you would have to talk to. It's funny how when asked, do you have any evidence? His mind doesn't go to the things that he talks about, the photos or the videos that he presents. I would like to follow that up by saying, Mr. Elizondo, what about the stuff that you talk about in your book tour? Don't you have pictures and videos? Are those not evidence? Because I'm wondering if the reason he excluded that is because they're public domain, so he doesn't feel like it's something he should bring up here, or was it an oversight in his head? Because he's under oath here, he doesn't want to talk about those things. Maybe because, again, those are part of his book tour to tell a compelling story, but don't really constitute hard evidence, even in his own head. One way or the other, it's interesting that here, if you simplify the question, he's asked, do you have any evidence that would convince me that this is real? And he goes, no, I don't. The US government does. I find that really, really interesting for someone who wrote a book about this. You know what I mean? But then we have this other answer, and again, we see him come to life and make a really good point that's very well presented. So this whole capability versus intent thing. So he says, to determine threat, we look at capability versus intent. And again, those illustrators are coming to life, and he's speaking confidently, and it's a really good point, and it's well said. And he says, we know capability, but we don't know intent. And I like this answer because he's not assuming. In the other hearing that took place last year, there were moments that I talked about in the analysis where intent was being assumed, where they were being asked about the intent, and there were times where they said we can't know the intent, but there were times where they kind of assumed what this thing might want. That didn't happen in this hearing, and I was happy to see that. At no point did any of these gentlemen assume that they know what these things want. They just said, here's what we know based on these stories. That's it. In conclusion, what do we have here? So once again, it is a frustrating hearing because it seems that we're constantly coming to the edge of information, but we're never taking that step into information. Whenever we get close, it's we would have to discuss this in private. I don't have access to that information. You know, you would have to go to the government for this. And it also seems like any accounts that we're getting are third party. That it's, you know, I saw this in an email. I talked about this. I have access to documents. I was told this. But we still don't have someone saying, guys, listen, I saw this. Like under oath, in a room, in a lab, I saw this. And I know based on my experience that that cannot be human. We're still not there. We're still not, look at this picture that I took myself of this thing that's being hidden. We don't have that. And again, we have people who are saying that they went through the proper channels to be able to talk about the things that they're allowed to talk about. So the government's going, yeah, okay, go talk about these things. And again, my mind goes back to a controlled leak. And I've talked about in my previous analysis why this might be, but it could very well be to unite the people, right? To say like, okay, let's talk about this, put this information out there, because everyone pretty much will agree that we need more information on this. So we could come together and say, yeah, we demand more information, right? We're getting bipartisan agreement from Congress. We're getting everyone at the hearing saying, we need more information. Who do we talk to? But let me know in the comments what you think. Were there any answers here that made you go, oh, I didn't know that, and convinced you one way or the other, whether it's about the existence of these things or the non-existence of these things? Did anything steer you a certain way? Did you get more concrete answers out of this than you previously had? Or was it just more questions and more moving along that same path without actually getting answers? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you on the next one.